think, and we're kind of shifting that direction of these sort of broader questions, and one that I'm hearing in various aspects of the last couple of questions is this problem of and I'll go back to your terms, Jason, projects to remake the world, capitalism as a project to remake the world, but we're wanting to know what the new project is to remake the non-capitalist world. And, you know, in the US and the particular arguments you're bringing up there is a prime example of, and this I'm picking on the U.S., but this is everywhere.
No, you should pick on the U.S. for sure.
Because it's blatant right now because it's blasted on our TV every night. This blatant lack of an imaginary of anything other than, well, it's got to be the A or the B. We've got to have this logic of there's a conflict between Team A and Team B, and which team is going to get us there. None of those teams are getting us there very clearly. But there's this lack of our ability to imagine that other thing, and I mean, I think smart and creative people too. When you get the big question comes up, you know, well, what the hell else do we do? It's very difficult to work our way through that question. So I know there's a hand here, so maybe I can just sort of I'll flag that and leave it hanging in the air so we can maybe come back to. But it's because we're all going to say, well, I don't really have the answer, but we need collectively to think the question.
But there are clear priorities that have to be met, so there are implicit answers around which we can debate.
Exactly. But I want to go ahead.
Yeah. So you sort of begin with this notion of an originary nature-culture split that I know this, it's all a bit arbitrary, but you placed it at 1492. But I'm curious about why nature had to be created. Like, why was this, so it's a sort of broad conceptual question, but what was the advantage, or what like role did it play, and why did it have to be this, was it just to produce cheap things, and why did cheap things, I'm just, why did they have to involve or occupy that realm? I mean, why couldn't these places just have been conquered and pillaged as they had been traditionally? Why did a sort of ideology have to be created around them, I guess, is my question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really important. There's several short answers, and of course the story is more complicated. One is that the pillage just doesn't get you very far. All right. So to reestablish productive systems based on a class antagonism of owners, some in the form of colonial planters, mine owners, et cetera, and then using cheap labor, racialized labor. In the mines, in the plantation systems, in the obrahis of the workshops, the industrial workshops of places like Quito, colonial Quito, in the 17th century. This provides a basis for ongoing flows of wealth.
Sure.
So that's one important moment. The other moment is 1492, like you said, is I wouldn't say arbitrary, but is a kind of signpost that's easy to remember. We are, of course, dealing with a process of becoming. And when and where did this qualitative break occur is a bit different in different zones of emergent Atlantic capitalism in this period. My friend Orlando Bethencourt has written a beautiful book on that called The Matter of Empire, which is about the theological debates that culminate in Las Casas and Sepúlveda at Valladolid in the early 1550s around the status of indigenous persons. And you can see there a real wrestling around how do we in the court of Charles V, and it was largely resolved by the time Philip II comes in 1556 and 1557 around what is the status of the indigenous person. Can the indigenous person be enslaved or not? And then, of course, those questions were decisively shaped as well by the active resistance, including political resistance and legal. In fact, legal cases brought by indigenous peoples all the way to the Iberian Peninsula in the 16th and 17th centuries. But the short version is to racialize labor and to use the boundary line of civilization and nature was crucial to reproducing a system of very cheap labor, and cheap labor means high profit.
But who are they trying to fool, is my question. Like, who is...
Well, In my experience, humans are very good at fooling themselves, but they took it very seriously. So famously, Las Casas, who denounced the treatment of indigenous peoples by the Spanish Empire, when the silver mining output in Potosi collapsed in the 1560s, Philip II sends a new viceroy, Francisco de Toledo, to Peru. And one of the first things that Toledo does is ban Las Casas' books, because the ideas are dangerous. So there is this very definite and practical usage of the line between civilization and nature. And the idea of that civilization could come and then be a kind of a school of civilization, to use U.B. Phillips' description of African American plantation slavery, that it was a school for civilization where Africans could learn to be civilized peoples. And this was very much reflected in the discourse, both of the 16th and the 19th century. But this also comes up very powerfully in the English language. Indeed, our words for society and nature, they both assume their modern meanings in the English language in the century after 1550, right? And it's not by accident. And it has a lot, it's not only about this, but it has a lot to do with the renewed English subordination of England after 1541, but also, of course, with the defeat of the peasant resistance to capitalist enclosure in the countryside, which really crescendos in 1549 with Kett's Rebellion. So sometimes, there are these Marxists like Andreas Malm who says, oh, More is just playing around with words, as if somehow words are not connected to ideas, are not connected to real practices of, just ask the witch if how she feels about the power of that word and the way that that word was redefined in the 16th century. I think that's the answer that I give you. It feels to me like it's economically functionalist, and it's so much more than that. But ultimately, we call it capitalism because it is a system that reproduces through the endless accumulation of capital, and that is.
Also, it needs fantasy.
It does need. Thank you. I mean, that's neoclassical economics today, right? They don't care if it actually connects with something in the world. It's what's the R squared on that, or what their more sophisticated version of quantitative analysis says.
I've got a couple questions, so I'm going to get to three of you right now, and then we'll have all of you, and then we'll respond. Arthur.
That's me. Okay. I just wanted to comment briefly on questions about why was it necessary, and I think in addition to the functional aspects that you're bringing up, is that there's some. It seems to me that there's something of an ethical necessity in making that split, that to sort of articulate a nature society split is sort of a necessary precondition to exploit the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And at the back.
Yeah, I'd like to know, you consider France's attitude towards trade with China is a blessing in disguise for all things there.
That's going to be interesting.
Okay.
And back here.
I know that you critique capital and nature, but I'm just wondering what's your working definition for undercase nature? Because I only read the intro for your book, this one, but I didn't quite get a definition. And just to, quote Donna Haraway, that nature is never self-evident. So I'm just wondering what your.
Well, nature is never self-evident, but what do we look? I agree. I agree with what a lot of physical scientists say. We have a web of life that is extraordinarily complex. It's not just about this planet. It's we understand now in terms of climate history there are Milankovitch cycles. There are other variations. There are solar minima and maxima are hugely important. And I think what happened is that, especially in the humanities and social sciences, people took a very interesting extraction occurred, which is they moved from environments to the environment, and there are always environments, and indeed the way, of course, the way that ecologists, for instance, study their objects of analysis, ecosystems. Those are environments. They are species-environment relations. The species impact the environments make the species, and oh yes, the environments are also full of species, as well as various geographical, topographical, geological, atmospheric, other issues that are going on. So I mean the web of life in a fairly straightforward way. The web.
Nature, whenever you mention nature with an undercase, it's web of life.
Right. Yes. But we don't. I mean, yes. Okay. The question about Trump. Who knows? I mean, Trump's not going to go very far with China because China still owns a gigantic chunk of the U.S. debt. So,
Assuming it went ahead anyway.
but if China loses faith stops buying the American debt, then the whole world economy is going to melt down because the dollar can't be the world's reserve currency, and that will issue a whole series of cascading effects in every area of life. And the question of ethical. Yes, of course, these debates are taken very seriously, right? That John Locke, it's very interesting when first of all, it's interesting, John Locke is the most influential political philosopher of the American Revolution, but he's usually thought of as an English intellectual, but he writes most of his major works in the Dutch Republic. So there's a very interesting sort of geography to all of this. But one of the interesting things that he does when he writes the Constitution for Carolina at the end of the 17th century, and Carolina was then huge, including what became Georgia, is a vast area, is that he forbade indigenous peoples or English invaders could not enter into legal contracts with indigenous peoples. Right, so so there that law. I mean, capitalism can't function without law, right? And so you're right. It is functional. It is ethical. Anything that's it's. I mean, I think that's the old nugget of certain sort of rather crude forms of cultural anthropology or materialist anthropology. We're saying that there's always a material moment, but there's no neat and tidy separation between the ethics of something and the materiality of something, right? That we're looking at how they're entangled. So it's absolutely right to highlight that.
Okay. Well, no, so we'll take two here. So go ahead, Ed.
Do you see like any kind of like political purchase at all on like kind of more kind of catastrophic kind of narratives? Like I'm thinking of like this recent kind of report sort of saying kind of like come on guys, we need to sort of like get a move on. Like do you think there's any kind of like benefit in terms of like catastrophic sort of that kind of thing, or do you think it's completely like it just should be like
We got 10 years or game over.
Yeah.
That kind of logic. Okay. Should we?
Gosh, I don't know how to frame this, but basically I celebrate the connection you're making between the origins of capitalism and colonialism. Of course, welcome, very welcome. And there are tons of literature coming from Latin America talking about it, and the concept of coloniality, which I think is very relevant in terms of this discussion, and it's how we all live. I mean, we still live in that world. So I wonder whether you are openly talking about the ontological and epistemological, modern, modern ontology, because it's one, and then there are epistemologies that support this, and whether, how we can actually challenge the assumptions and the way we reproduce them on daily basis, unconsciously, even by the way we ask the questions. When we are asking the question, we are embedded in that system. So how we can, think through it, in different ways.
Well, I think that we need to build communities of struggle, of thought, that encourage an experimentation with the language and that support that. And there are a lot of academic dissidents in the room here, thank goodness. And we also have to realize that the structures of academia work in a very alienated, in Marx's sense, and there's a lot of reproduction of the purpose of a lot of academia and a lot of academics is to reproduce the status quo in various ways, to add quantitatively to knowledge. But a friend of mine said to me, he said, Jason, the problem with what you're doing is that if we take it seriously, we have to rethink like everything. And most of us just don't want to do that. Now, I want to say out loud, I'm not saying I give the answers for rethinking everything, but I think that a lot of us have come to this sense of where we're at, that there is a fundamental opportunity and need for synthesis, and I think that that's what Quijano and all his comrades were doing, and we see this from the direction of materialist and Marxist feminisms. I think of all the great work that Titi Bhattacharya has been doing in sort of bringing back social reproduction theory. There are a lot of us in different moments, and we have to keep reaching out against the boundaries of how these fields are constructed and policed by who gets jobs and who gets tenure and who gets research funding and all this. So we have to build communities of struggle within universities, but also outside and in between, that actively confront and disrupt the structures of knowledge that have brought us to this point, right? And they anesthetize us. So as you say, and we all fall into this, we use the language of the colonizer all the time. And so we need to build, I think, communities that ask. I mean, this is how I teach my students, both my undergrads and grads. I say, look, a good critique says that this is useful, and if we take this with this over here, we can reconstruct something and do something interesting. Or, like, here's a problem that could be remedied if we brought in these other insights to support this argument. That's a very different mode of critique than, on page 125, Jason, you said this, and I think that's really messed up because my favorite theorist is, I don't know, John Bellamy Foster or somebody. I love John Bellamy Foster. He was a friend of mine for many years. It still says many good, very, very good and important things. So there's that. And then where's the question from over here? Yeah. So just rephrase it really briefly, because.
I mean, I know you're against catastrophic thinking.
Oh yes, about catastrophes. Yeah. No, I mean, to be clear, I think that the catastrophic moments have already begun to hit. We're not waiting for it to hit. I think that capitalism has been a rolling catastrophe for 5 centuries. And yes, that what we are seeing today is distinctive in all sorts of ways. I am not against emphasizing that capitalism is a catastrophe. I think that we need to step back for a moment and ask very seriously whether saying, we have 5 years or 10 years or the end is coming, repent, is going to work. This is the moment of truth. It doesn't matter. There's a very evangelical flavor to that kind of environmentalism, and it cuts across kind of Marxist radical mainstream approaches. It's how do we make that argument within a framework of what I would call an ecology of hope? That's not just wistful, like I hope it all works out, but that is grounded in something. And for that, I think that we have to be able to see how capitalism organizes humans with the rest of nature and the rest of nature with humans at every single point. I mean, I remember 15 years ago saying things like there's no ecological degradation, soil degradation, and deforestation in the sugar plantations of, say, colonial Brazil without African labor. And eco-socialists pushing back at that. That's not in our framework. There's no labor in the metabolic rift. That's a separate thing. I'm like, anyone who studies food and agriculture knows this intimately, or anyone who studies, say, disease knows this. It's that we are part of the environments we are making and that is making us.
So, I always like the thesis on Feuerbach quote that you did about the explain however you do something. So, I've been an eco-socialist for about 10 years, but I've been a socialist for about 30 years beyond that, and I was sort of at odds with capitalism for another 10 years before that. Hasn't been totally encouraging in our experience. However, I have noticed along the way that there are times when certain ideas, and it's not necessarily because of brilliance, but sometimes more happenstance than others, that certain ideas galvanize, act as a little minor explosion that sets off other ones, right? That actually changes some things about history. It still hasn't diverted capitalism, but it seems to me at this stage of the game, with the urgency that the governmental panel report has reinforced. I'm surprised as to how many people think that it wasn't urgent the day before that report came out, or 10 years before that report came out. Then we have to try and get out of and I've been guilty of organizing these meetings where we discuss things, to where we actually go out and organize people to do stuff. And right now, there's a whole, unlike 10 years ago, and unlike 5 years ago, there's a huge percentage of the population that not only understands that we're in an ecological crisis, but a significant percentage of those understand that capitalism is the root cause. They may have different levels of willingness to assign culpability to capitalism, but they all understand that that's kind of there, right? So the next logical question is, what do we do about it on the big board? And your reference to Sweden comes up a lot when you ask that question, or similar things, right? The fact that every political party, every country, and the world now has a climate plan indicates that people know that the alternative to this chaos, that is capitalism, is a plan, right? So maybe we should be going out at some point, and rather than saying, we have to get community, we have to get a movement, we have to get something, is proposing that we have a discussion about how do we start the process of getting a democratic transition plan from now to where we have to get to, right? And as soon as you start doing that, you have to pull in people from all different struggles, right? Because it's going to have to be an equal plan, an equal planning process in order to be anywhere near successful. It's going to have to deal with war. It's going to have to deal with immigrants. It's going to have to deal with, just about every other question that we want to have to deal with, right? And, it can start in a place like Vancouver, maybe roll over to a place like Beijing, maybe, Paris, or, outside of Paris, Montreux will have a conference, right? But if we could start the idea that there is actually a process that collectivizes the struggle.
And can we take one more?
I think, yeah.
Yeah, it just
Yeah.
reminds me of an article in the New Yorker last week by Elizabeth Colbert, one of my favorite nonfiction writers.
I like her too.
And she writes about the loss of habitat and the loss of species. And then there's a little line that stuck with me, la la la, but we can't hear you, referring to governments. And so here in Canada, we don't have a plan. We have a prime minister who's ramming pipelines down our throats. We have a provincial premier who's giving $6 billion in subsidies to frack LNG and build a dam that will flood and violate treaty rights of First Nations and destroy rich, fertile farmland that could feed 1 million people. And this is a provincial government that many people voted for because we believed that they were pro-ecology. So,
Maybe that word just means something to them, different to them.
well, and of course, prior to the election last year, they were against the Site C dam. They were against LNG. So, and there is a lot of activism about those issues, and a lot of people that feel completely betrayed and will never vote for the NDP again, for example. So, so it's interesting, that sort of schism between being duped and,
Right.
Yeah.
being
But I mean, the reference to Colbert, Elizabeth Colbert, not the other Colbert, is interesting. I mean, I like Colbert too, and Colbert is part of the problem that she refuses to name the system. So she hasn't made, and that's something that although I have minor disagreements with Klein's book, I think that is just a masterpiece because it understands. She understands very clearly that capitalism is the problem. And you're right that between the two comments, we are at a moment where we can talk about the problems and contradictions of capitalism again. We know that there is something fundamentally violent and really although there's a spectrum here, but something unfixable about the present business as usual, even if many people don't want to quite name it. Now, what I think, on the plus side, we are seeing a massive generational shift in many parts of the world. But certainly we've seen it in Europe and North America. How that will play into politics is an interesting and fascinating question. We've seen, very modest but still promising sort of shakeup on the left of the Democratic Party, and a number of right-wing Democratic state senators in my state of New York were lost their primaries. So there are hopeful moments that we're seeing. But of course, this is the thing about social revolutions and revolts. Nobody ever sees it coming. Lenin in February 1917 has given speeches to Swiss socialists saying, we're never going to see revolution in Russia. So that's the thing about extraordinary moments of social revolt and protest and everything else. And my guess is the two of you would have much better insights as to what is to be done in terms of organizing than I do. But I think in terms of the clarity of our message, we have to insist on the decommodification of crucial elements of life. And we have to draw the line on pipeline struggles, right? The Blockadia, here, Stephen gave me once in Blockadia here. The Blockadia is absolutely something that we need to be unified around. We need to, we were having a discussion, we need to stop just saying stop it, but we need to stop it and we need to build something new. And that means we have to have clarity around the experience of various state socialisms, not Sweden, which is not socialist, which was a preeminent sort of and if you've lived in Sweden, which I did for a number of years, you will experience it as a place of extraordinary alienation, as many young Swedes do. It has a very high suicide rate, for instance. That we need to take very seriously the experience of socialist reconstruction. And that's not going to be an easy thing to do, or something with saints and sinners that we are easy to draw up on one side of the ledger or not. So I think that's something that we also need to go back to. Just as we have the opportunity to talk about capitalism, we need to have a new discussion around the state socialist experience, which was extraordinary in both very good and very bad ways. So, but that's been taboo for a lot of years.
I think we have, because I think we have time for maybe one or two last short questions.
So I wonder how world ecologist reconciles or comments about this goal toward decommodification of as many processes of life with the recent Nobel Prize in economics for Nordhaus, I think there was two people, but one is the one that advocates carbon taxing. And one problem is that in some articles he was trying to price 1 ton of carbon at $8, and another one $21. The Canadian state is trying to price it at $50 Canadian for 2022. So, where does that logic fit with trying to decommodify? I'll say one more thing that Eduardo Godinez says. This is this Peruvian, Uruguayan critic of extractivism.
Yeah.
And he thinks this is a condition for further endless accumulation. Carbon pricing, overtaxing.
Yeah, anything to make capital pay should be entertained seriously. Whether Nordhaus is really interested in making capital pay is a different question. And then but it's not going to be enough simply to tax, because we know there's a very uncomfortable history to mention when we look at the history of capital really being threatened. And then when capital experiences a zero-sum situation, those are the classic revolutionary situations of Vietnam, for instance, or Russia, or other places. When there's a zero-sum conflict, then we have very difficult transitions, very violent transitions. And I'm not sure how to deal with that. One of the things that I learned as a sort of recovering economic historian in doing this is that the history of war, I think somebody mentioned war, and that the history of war and war making is fundamentally bound up with the accumulation of capital in really, really fascinating ways that the Marxist tradition has done a terrible job with. So, it's a great question, but any effort to make capital pay should be entertained seriously.
And is there a last question someone's been holding and wants to, or comment someone wants to make? Yeah.
I think I'm just sort of following on the theme that we've kind of been developing, just sort of this hunger for like practical projects or understandable projects or communicatable projects. And I noticed that you listed a couple things that really helped me sort of maybe have something to grab onto. And so you talked about, I can't remember what you called it exactly, but the sort of the accumulation of social goods, or a social common accumulation, and sort of investing into sort of decommodified and sort of, and again you repeated like decommodifying crucial aspects of life, and then you added anything to make capital pay. Are there other sort of, while you're on that track of kind of
Well, American.
you said clear, there are, we don't have the final plan, but there are clear priorities. So I just wanted to know if you had any more.
Well, just socialize the means of reproduction fully. The funny thing is, in a perverse way, the history of American capitalism is precisely about that. Just if you look at the post-World War II expansion, the Eisenhower highway project, massive subsidies for housing, the GI Bill for education. These were massive social projects to subsidize reproduction, granted for a white so-called middle class in the United States. But there is a long and clear record of this, in some ways more progressive across the Western European experience. The Attlee government comes in 46. It gets, and Churchill goes out and they build the NHS and they institute social housing and all these kinds of things. So there's a history of this, even within the history of capitalism. My friend Christian Parenti calls it capitalism's shadow socialism. I'm not sure if that's how we want to look at it, but when we look at what's possible or realistic, there's already that experience in the history of capitalism. It's just been for the reproduction of white supremacy and capital accumulation and all the rest of it. But there is a history there, that instead of building the easy, cheap roads to the suburbs, rebuild the cities around just and sustainable housing, build farm belts around the major cities, find ways to turn supermarkets into public utilities that support farmers in the surrounding areas, nationalize the banks and turn banking into a public utility. All of these ideas are fundamental to the kind of transition that we're talking about. None are socialism, whatever that means, or whatever term you want for a just and equitable and sustainable future. I don't care what the particular phrase we use is, but how do we get there? And I think that there are these experiences. There's also the experiences of basically constructing something from nothing in the history of socialisms that, amongst other things, broke the back of Nazi power. taking a country that was was completely non-industrialized in the 1920s and destroyed by civil war and invasion, Russia, and turning it into a social formation that could defeat Nazism, more or less on its own. That's not a footnote in the history of what is possible, although one hopes we could find a rather more peaceful way to go about the whole process.
Just gonna make a comment in wrapping up, and part of it is simply to express my own befuddlement and despair and general lack of hope in recent years. And I both need these kind of occasions where we have these large conversations and feel the what we can do question, or what is to be done question, as eternally deferred. And I don't know how to get around that at this point. So out of my befuddlement and unknowing, I thought I'd just end by reading a very short poem. And we can shift slightly into a different register of language, maybe a different part of our probably now tired brains. And I'll just, here you go, just one little very short fragment of something. Underneath the poetry, not just description, but the act. The biotariot at borehole 1 and 2, ravens and bears, last Kinder, last Morgan, or imagine pipes collapsing beneath re-indigenized streets. Black once pulsing veins of some carboniferous leviathan, and not a single car on the roads. Everyone having forgotten the practice of speed in isolation, taking instead to small crystalline streams to catch water striders in outstretched palms. Can we, thank you, that was good. Can we thank Jason
Thank you
for
all.
entertaining everything we had to say and responding so well? Thank you.